We've already seen many times how to deploy a contract using the Remix IDE, but you can also deploy a contract using Vyper. Now there are several ways to deploy a contract using Vyper. Here I will explain one of the built-in functions called createMinimalProxy2. To use createMinimalProxy2 to deploy a contract, we first need to deploy a master copy contract. In our example, we will deploy the test by contract, and this will be our master copy contract. On the diagram here, you can see that the master copy contract, let's call this M, and in this example, this will be the test.by contract. And now to deploy this same contract, we'll create a factory contract, which we'll call the built-in function createMinimalProxy2, and we'll pass in the address of the master copy contract into this function. The function createMinimalProxy2 will deploy a new contract, let's call this contract A, and it's going to deploy the same contract, test.by. And now let's say that the user calls contract A. What contract A will do is it will delegate all calls to the master copy contract. Remember that delegate call executes the code inside the target. Here the target will be the master copy contract, but the update is going to happen inside contract A. So this is how you will use the function createMinimalProxy2 to deploy a contract, and how the contract that is deployed execute its code. Now the constructor, the init function, is not called when a contract is deployed using the createMinimalProxy2. So when we deploy the master copy contract, the code inside the constructor will be executed. However, when we use createMinimalProxy2 to deploy contract A, the code inside the constructor will not be executed. So this means that when we deploy the contract A using createMinimalProxy2, the state variable owner will be an empty 0 address. To make sure that the owner is set, let's create a function where we will be able to call once after we call the function createMinimalProxy2. So I'll type external def, I'll call this setOwner, and for the input, let's pass in the address of the owner address. So what we want to do here is say self.owner is equal to the owner passed from the input. And we want to make sure that this function can only be called once. So we'll say assert self.owner is equal to the empty address, the 0 address. And let's say the error message, if the owner is not an empty address, we'll say already initialized. Okay, so this is the example contract that we will deploy using the function createMinimalProxy2. Next, let's create a factory contract, which we'll call this function. So going to the File Explorer, I'll create a file called factory.by. And I'll start by defining the interface. Since we're going to need to call this function, I'll copy this, and then I'll paste it here. And then I'll declare an interface. Let's call this iTest. And we're going to be able to call the function setOwner. Since this is going to write to the state variable owner, this will be non-payable. Next, let's create a function that will deploy the test contract. So say add external. I'll call this function deploy. Remember, back over here, that to call createMinimalProxy2, you'll need to pass in the address of the master copy contract. So over here, I'll say master copy address. And then for the owner, we'll pass in message sender. Okay, and then we call the function createMinimalProxy2. And it's going to take in a single input, the address of the master copy contract, master copy. Now, if you want to send ether when we deploy this contract, we can specify an optional input called value. For example, if we wanted to say 1 way of ether, then we will say 1. But for this example, we'll keep it simple, just deploy the master copy contract. Calling this will return an address. So let's say ADDR of type address. Okay, are we done? Well, not yet. After we deploy the contract, we need to set the owner state variable. And to do that, since the constructor is not executed, we'll need to call the function setOwner. Okay, so going back, we'll say external call iTest at addr.setOwner. And for the owner, we'll pass in message sender, message.sender. Okay, so this is how you would deploy a contract using createMinimalProxy2, and then call some initialization setup. In our case, this is done inside the function setOwner. Now, before I move on to the demo, I also want to see what address this contract was deployed at. So to do that, I'm going to create an event and then emit this address. Let's call this event log, and it's going to emit the address of the contract that we deployed. Address log, the event log with the address. Okay, let's try compiling this contract. Compile. Once the contract is compiled, we will deploy this. And then we also need to deploy the master copy contract. So let's select the test by contract and then compile it and then also deploy it. Okay, so we now have two contracts, the factory contract and our master copy contract called test. Let's try deploying a copy of this contract. So I'll copy this address, and then to deploy, you'll pass in the address of the master copy contract and then hit transact. Okay, the transaction was successful, so we need to look for the address of the contract that was deployed. Inside the logs, okay, inside the event name log, the address, the contract address that was deployed is this one. So I'll copy this one, and then to load it onto Remix IDE, make sure that I've selected the test contract, and instead of hitting deploy, I'll load this contract at this address. Scrolling down, now I see two test contracts. The first one is the master copy, and the second one is the one that we just deployed. Okay, if we call the state variable owner, the owner is this account, starting with 5B3. Scrolling back up, we can check that our account also starts with 5B3.